The wind was a blade, honed sharp on the teeth of the mountains. It screamed across the endless white, carving drifts that buried fences and erased the very notion of a path. In this maelstrom of ice and fury, she moved, a ghost of a thing, less a woman than a prayer for survival. Alara stumbled, her body a vessel of shivering agony, the blood of childbirth still a dull, persistent ache within her. Wrapped in a threadbare blanket against her chest was the source of her shame and the sole reason for her will. A newborn, silent and terrifyingly still. The town had cast her out. The preacher's words had been stones, thrown with righteous fury. Harlot, abomination. They had cut a ragged lock of her hair, a public brand, and pointed her toward the wilderness, shamed while still bleeding, an offering to the unforgiving god of winter. Now the wilderness was claiming its due. Her vision blurred, the swirling snow a hypnotic dance of death. One boot caught on something hidden, and she pitched forward, landing in a soft, cold finality. She curled her body around the tiny bundle, a last act of defiance against the cold. The darkness that tugged at the edges of her sight felt like a mercy. This was where it ended. He found her an hour later, a dark mound against the stark white of his fence line. Silas had seen death in all its forms. In the dust-choked gullies of the war, in the quiet, fever-racked stillness of his own home. He recognized its scent on the wind. He dismounted, his horse stamping nervously, breath pluming in the frigid air. He expected a wolf-torn deer, or perhaps a steer that had wandered and frozen. He did not expect a woman. He knelt, his gloved hand brushing the snow from her face. It was pale, chapped, but young. Then he saw the bundle clutched to her chest. A low groan escaped him, a sound torn from a place of old, scarred over pain. For a moment he was paralyzed. The ghosts of his wife, Sarah, and his boy, Daniel, rose from the snow, their faces superimposed on this frozen Madonna and child. His first instinct, the one born of years of self-imposed isolation, was to turn away, to ride back to his cabin, stoke the fire, and pretend he'd seen nothing. This was not his trouble. He had buried his trouble in 2 small graves on the hill behind his home. But then, a faint, mewling cry, thin as a spider's thread, cut through the wind. It was a sound of life, fragile and impossibly persistent. It hooked into him, a barb in his soul he could not pull free. With a curse that was half prayer, Silas gathered her up. She was lighter than a sack of feed, a collection of cold limbs and brittle bones. He laid her gently over his saddle, securing the baby inside his own thick coat, the tiny form a startling warmth against his chest. The ride back was a battle against the storm and the memories it whipped up. The cabin was his fortress against the world, a place of monastic silence. Bringing her inside felt like a violation of a sacred pact he'd made with his own grief. He laid her on the cot near the hearth, the one that had been Sarah's. He worked with a grim, practiced efficiency, stripping away her frozen, torn dress, his gaze clinical, avoiding the jaggedly cut hair, the mark of her disgrace. He saw the signs of recent childbirth and his jaw tightened. He wrapped her in dry, warm blankets and forced sips of lukewarm broth between her blue-tinged lips. For 3 days, she drifted in a fevered haze. Silas tended the fire, melted snow for water, and cared for the infant with an awkward, rusty tenderness. He fed the boy drops of watered-down cow's milk from a clean rag, his large, calloused hands fumbling but gentle. The baby's cries filled the cabin's oppressive silence, and Silas found they were a sound he could bear, unlike the ghost echoes of his own son's laughter. When Alara finally woke, her eyes, the color of a stormy sky, were wide with terror. She saw him sitting across the room, a large, quiet man silhouetted by the firelight, his face a mask of shadows and old sorrow. She flinched, pulling the blanket tighter, her hand instinctively going to her chest, searching for her child. Silas nodded toward the cradle he'd hastily fashioned from a packing crate, set near the warmth of the fire. "He's all right," he said. His voice was rough from disuse, like stones grinding together. Took some milk, she said nothing. Her gaze darted around the small, sparse cabin. The single room, the stone hearth, the rifle mounted over the mantel, the stark cleanliness of a man living utterly alone. It was a shelter, but it was also a cage, and he was the keeper. The days that followed unfolded in a heavy, watchful silence. He would cook, leaving a plate of food on the small table for her. She would wait until he was outside, tending his stock, before she would creep out to eat, her movements furtive as a spooked deer. She cared for the baby, her love for the child a fierce, silent thing that filled the space her words did not. He never asked her name. He never asked where she came from or why she was branded and cast out. He knew the cruelty of small towns and smaller minds. He saw the story in the hollows of her cheeks, in the way she never met his eyes, in the tremor of her hands when he moved too suddenly. He gave her the one thing he suspected no one else had, the dignity of her silence. He spoke only when necessary. More wood for the fire, storms breaking. Stews on each phrase was an offering, laid carefully in the space between them. She would respond with a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was a language of its own, this communication of gestures and shared solitude. One evening, he was cleaning his rifle by the firelight, the methodical scrape and click of metal a familiar comfort. The baby was sleeping. Alara sat on the cot, stitching a tear in one of his shirts she'd found in a chest. The needlework was fine, precise. It spoke of a different life. He found himself watching her hands, the rhythmic dip and pull of the needle. He looked up and found her watching him, her guard down for a fraction of a second. In her eyes, he saw not fear, but a profound, weary sadness that mirrored his own. He cleared his throat and looked away first, back to his rifle. "My wife, Sarah," he said, the words feeling foreign, sharp-edged in his mouth. "She used to mend my things. Was always tellin' me I was too hard on my clothes." Alara's hands stilled in her lap. He didn't look at her, just kept his focus on the oiled rag and the gunmetal. "We had a boy." "Daniel," he stopped. The silence rushed back in, heavier than before, thick with the names of the dead. He placed a single, perfectly carved wooden horse on the mantel. It was worn smooth from the touch of small hands. Fever took him. 2 winters passed, he said nothing more. He didn't need to. He had offered her a piece of his own brokenness, a shard to match her own. Later that night, as the wind moaned a mournful tune around the eaves, she spoke for the first time in more than a whisper. "Jebediah," she said, her voice a raw, fragile thing. "His name is Jebediah." Silas stopped his pacing, turning to face her. She was sitting up, the firelight flickering across her face, making her look like a tormented saint in an old painting. "His father. His family owns the valley. The whole valley." She clutched the blanket, her knuckles white. "They have righteous men on their side. The preacher, the sheriff. They said I was a stain on his name. That this child," she looked at the cradle, her voice cracking, "was a sin made flesh. They drove me out. So no one would know." The story came out in broken pieces, a confession whispered to the dancing flames. She had loved him, or thought she had. He had promised her things. When the child was undeniable, he had turned on her, his fear of his father greater than any affection for her. The town, eager to please the powerful family, had followed suit. Silas listened, his expression unchanging, but a cold, hard anger began to smolder deep within him. It was an old, familiar feeling, the righteous anger of a man who had seen too much injustice. He walked over to the cradle and looked down at the sleeping infant. The boy's face was peaceful, innocent of the world's cruelty. "He needs a name," Silas said, his voice low. Alara looked up at him, tears shimmering in her eyes. I don't know what to call him. He's a fighter," Silas stated. "A fact. Survived that storm. That's something." Her gaze fell upon the small wooden horse on the mantel, the tribute to his lost son. "Samuel," she whispered. "His name is Samuel." A tremor went through Silas. It was not his son's name, but it was close enough to be a bomb and a wound all at once. He gave a single, sharp nod. Samuel, he repeated. Sounded right. It sounded like a beginning. The thaw came both outside and in. As the snow receded, revealing the sleeping earth beneath, the oppressive silence in the cabin began to recede, too. Alara started joining him for meals at the table. Her movements became less fearful, more certain. She would hum a quiet tune to Samuel, a melody that sounded both sad and sweet. Silas found himself fixing things he'd let go for years. He repaired a broken chair. He rethatched a section of the barn roof. He mended the fences, not just with wire and posts, but with a renewed sense of purpose. He was no longer just maintaining a prison of grief. He was building a sanctuary. He taught her to shoot the rifle, not for hunting but for protection. She was a natural, her hand steady, her eye clear. As she held the weapon, he saw a flicker of her old strength return, the resilience that had carried her through the storm. She was not just a victim, she was a survivor. One afternoon, as they worked together in the small garden patch he'd tilled, he saw her smile for the first time. It was a small, fleeting thing, brought on by the sight of Samuel trying to grab a sunbeam. But it transformed her face, chasing away the shadows. In that moment, Silas felt a dangerous warmth spread through his chest, a feeling he'd long since buried, hope. It was a fragile peace, and he knew it. The world was larger than his small homestead, and men like Jebediah did not forget. Their fear and their pride were long-lived things. The day he saw the riders, he felt it not as a surprise, but as an inevitability. 3 of them, cresting the far ridge, their forms black against the afternoon sun. He didn't have to be told who they were. Alara, he said, his voice flat calm. Take Samuel. Go to the root cellar. Bolt it from the inside. Don't come out. Not for anything, she saw the look in his eyes, the quiet storm that had gathered there. The fear returned, stark and cold, but this time it was different. It was mingled with a defiant fury. She clutched his arm. Silas, go, he commanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. I'll handle this, she hesitated, then nodded, her face pale. She snatched the sleeping baby from his cradle, grabbed the rifle he'd taught her to use, and disappeared through the trapdoor in the floor. Silas watched the riders approach. He stood on his porch, unarmed, waiting. He recognized Jebediah immediately. Handsome, arrogant, with the cruel, weak mouth of a bully. The other 2 were hired muscle, their faces hard and impassive. They reined in their horses a few yards from the porch, kicking up dust. I'm looking for something that belongs to me, Jebediah called out, his voice dripping with condescension. He scanned the homestead with a proprietary air. A whore and her whelp. Saw her tracks head this way before the snows. You been keeping her for yourself, old man? Silas remained silent, his gaze as steady and unyielding as the mountains behind him. His stillness seemed to unnerve Jebediah. I know she's in there, Jebediah sneered, dismounting. Send her out. I'll deal with her and the bastard, and be on my way. My father wants this mess cleaned up. Permanently. She's not here, Silas said, his voice a low rumble. You got a bad map, Jebediah laughed, a short, ugly sound. Don't play games with me. I own this land. I own everything on it, including her. He took a step toward the porch. Now, step aside. This is my land, Silas corrected him, his voice dropping even lower, gaining a dangerous edge. And nothing on it is yours. You made your choice when you sent a woman and a newborn child into a blizzard to die. You gave up any claim. Jebediah's face contorted with rage. She's a stain, a filthy secret. She was supposed to disappear. She didn't, Silas said simply. He took a half-step back, his hand inching closer to the cabin door. You should. Turn around. Right away. Don't come back for a moment. Jebediah was taken aback by the man's sheer audacity. He looked at Silas, truly looked at him, and saw not just an old, weathered rancher but something else. Something hard and lethal that had been sleeping and was now awake. But his pride wouldn't let him back down. Kill him, he spat at his men. The world exploded into motion. The first man drew his pistol, but Silas was already moving. He was a blur of controlled violence, a ghost of the soldier he once was. He lunged off the porch, slamming his shoulder into the man's chest as the gun went off, the shot going wide. He drove the man into his own horse, using the chaos to draw the peacemaker tucked into the back of his waistband. The second rider was leveling his rifle, but Silas was faster. His first shot was precise, a punctuation mark to the end of a threat. The man grunted, clutching his shoulder as he toppled from the saddle. Jebediah stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief and terror. He fumbled for his own ornate pistol, his movements clumsy with panic. Silas turned to him, the setting sun glinting off the barrel of his revolver. His face was grim, his eyes chips of ice. "You wanted to clean up a mess," Silas said, his voice a dead calm. "This is what it looks like." He didn't shoot to kill. He shot the gun from Jebediah's hand, the impact sending a shock up the man's arm. Jebediah screamed, cradling his numbed, bleeding fingers. Silas walked toward him, the embodiment of a reckoning. He stood over the whimpering man, his shadow falling long and dark. "Get on your horse," Silas commanded, "and you tell your father that Alara and the boy Samuel are under my protection. You tell him that if anyone, and I mean anyone, from your valley ever sets foot on this land again, I will burn it to the ground. You tell him a man who has already lost everything has nothing left to fear." Jebediah scrambled back, his arrogance shattered, replaced by a primal terror. He climbed onto his horse, grabbing the reins of his wounded companion's mount, and fled, not looking back. Silas stood there until their dust was a smudge on the horizon. He was breathing heavily, his side burning where a splinter from the porch rail had torn into him during the fight. The adrenaline faded, leaving behind the familiar ache of old wounds, both fresh and ancient. He stood there for a long time, watching the sun bleed out across the sky. Then he turned and walked back to the cabin. "Alara," he called out, his voice hoarse. "It's done." The bolt on the trapdoor scraped back. She emerged, her face streaked with dust and tears, the rifle held tight in her hands. Samuel was awake, but quiet in her arms, his wide eyes taking in the world. She saw the blood on Silas's shirt, the exhaustion etched onto his face. She dropped the rifle and rushed to him. Her hands fluttered over his wound, her touch gentle, questioning. "It's nothing," he grunted, but didn't pull away. She looked at him, her eyes searching his. The fear was gone, replaced by something fierce and bright. Gratitude, respect, something more. She didn't say thank you. The words were too small for what he had done. Instead, she guided him to a chair and began to tend his wound, her movements now as practiced and certain as his had been in the fight. The silence that fell between them now was different. It was not a void, but a space filled with understanding. It was the comfortable quiet of two people who had weathered the same storm and found shelter in each other. As she finished bandaging his side, her hand lingered on his arm. He looked down at her hand, then up at her face. He saw not the shamed, broken creature he had found in the snow, but a woman of immense strength and courage. A woman who had fought her own war and won. "Silas," she said, her voice clear and strong. He met her gaze. "You claimed us," she said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "You redeemed us." He thought of the two graves on the hill, of the years of empty silence. He looked at this woman and the child she held, this small, improbable family forged in a blizzard and tempered by violence. He had not sought redemption. He believed he was beyond it, but it seemed to have found him anyway. He reached out, his calloused, trembling hand gently cupping Samuel's head. The baby leaned into his touch. "No," Silas said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "You redeemed me outside." The last vestiges of winter had finally melted away. The creek was running full and clear, and on the sunny slopes of the hills, the first purple wildflowers of spring were beginning to bloom.